Dust choked Oakhaven's streets as greedy men eyed a desperate widow. 7 crying orphans clung to her tattered skirt. Town elders planned to tear them apart, selling them like cattle. Then, a massive, scarred trapper stepped from shadows, throwing down his gold. His booming voice changed history forever. The Wyoming Territory, in the late autumn of 1872, was a place that offered no mercy. And it had certainly offered none to Sarah Montgomery. Standing on the warped, splintered wooden boardwalk outside of Walsh's Mercantile, Sarah looked out at the muddy, rutted thoroughfare of Oakhaven. The wind howled down from the Absaroka Range, carrying the bitter promise of an early winter, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the ice forming in Sarah's veins. She was 32 years old, draped in a faded calico dress that hung loosely on her thinning frame, her once bright auburn hair pinned back severely beneath a dark mourning bonnet. Just 3 weeks prior, her husband, Samuel Montgomery, had succumbed to a festering wound sustained when their overloaded wagon snapped an axle on the treacherous descent into the valley. Samuel had been a dreamer, a man who believed the West was paved with fertile soil and easy prosperity. He had borrowed heavily to fund their expedition, signing promissory notes to men with hard eyes and cold hearts. When Samuel died, breathing his last agonizing breaths in a leaky canvas tent on the edge of town, those notes immediately came due. Sarah was left with 0 assets, a staggering debt of $400, and 7 children. They stood huddled around her now, a bruised and terrified flock. Thomas. His jaw was set tight, trying desperately to project a manhood he hadn't quite grown into, his hands resting protectively on the shoulders of his 12-year-old sister, Mary. William, 10, stared blankly at the dirt, while the 8-year-old twins, James and John, buried their faces in the folds of Sarah's skirt. 5-year-old Emily sucked her thumb, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks, and baby Charles rested heavy and restless against Sarah's chest. Mayor Harrison Cobb, a portly man with a ruddy face and a pocket watch chain that rested on his expansive stomach, stepped onto an overturned apple crate. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and authoritative, drawing a crowd of cowboys, miners, and local merchants who had gathered for the spectacle. "Citizens of Oakhaven," Mayor Cobb bellowed, his voice ringing over the howling wind, "we are gathered today to settle the estate and debts of the late Samuel Montgomery. As the widow Montgomery has no means to satisfy the $400 owed to the First Bank of Oakhaven and to Mr. Walsh's Mercantile, the town council has decreed that her labor, and the labor of her offspring, shall be auctioned to the highest bidders to satisfy this lawful debt." Sarah closed her eyes, a tremor racking her fragile frame. They were not calling it slavery. They called it indentured contracts. But the reality was the same. She was about to be sold, and worse, her children were going to be ripped away from her. "Now," Cobb continued, adjusting his spectacles, "it is universally understood that no single household can take on the burden of a woman and 7 young mouths. Therefore, we shall divide the lots. Mr. Jedediah Walsh has expressed interest in purchasing the widow's contract for household labor. The older boys will be contracted to the logging camps, and the younger girls—" "No," Sarah screamed, the primal sound tearing from her throat. She stepped forward, clutching baby Charles so tightly he let out a startled cry. "Please, Mayor Cobb, I beg of you, I will work day and night. I will wash laundry. I will scrub floors. I will mend clothes. Just do not take my children. Do not separate my babies." Jedediah Walsh, a thin man with slicked-back dark hair and a predatory smirk, stepped out from the doorway of his mercantile. He chewed on a matchstick, his eyes raking over Sarah with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "Now, Sarah," Walsh said smoothly, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Be reasonable. You can barely feed yourself. I'm offering you a warm bed in the back of my shop. A woman needs protection in a town like this. But those kids? They're a liability. The logging camp will make men out of those boys. They are children, Jedediah." Sarah wept, the last vestiges of her pride shattering as she dropped to her knees on the rough wood. Thomas rushed forward, grabbing his mother's arm, his eyes blazing with helpless fury as he glared at the men surrounding them. "Let's begin," Mayor Cobb announced, ignoring the weeping woman at his feet. "Who will start the bidding for the labor of Thomas Montgomery, age 14? Do I hear $50? On the periphery of the gathered crowd, a shadow detached itself from the side of the livery stable. Gideon Cole had ridden into Oakhaven an hour earlier, leading 2 mules heavily laden with prime winter pelts. He was a man woven from the very fabric of the harsh wilderness he called home. Standing 6'4", Gideon possessed a broad, muscular frame hidden beneath a heavy coat of buffalo hide and fringed buckskin. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and a jagged white scar cut across his left cheekbone, a lasting souvenir from a grizzly bear that had nearly ended his life 5 winters ago in the Wind River Range. Gideon despised towns. He despised the noise, the greed, and the stench of too many people living too close together. He came down from his mountain cabin only twice a year to trade his furs for black powder, coffee, salt, and flour. He had intended to drop his pelts at the trading post and ride out before nightfall, but the anguished scream of the woman had stopped him in his tracks. Gideon had watched the scene unfold with quiet, simmering rage. He knew the cruel mathematics of survival on the frontier, but he also knew injustice when he saw it. He looked at the woman on her knees, her shoulders shaking, and then he looked at the 7 children, 7 pairs of wide, terrified eyes. They looked like cornered kits, about to be thrown to the wolves. Mayor Cobb raised his wooden gavel. "I have $50 from Mr. Henderson for the oldest boy." Going once, Gideon's heavy leather boots hit the boardwalk with the force of falling timber. The crowd parted instantly, men stepping back in instinctual fear as the massive mountain man pushed his way to the front. The stench of wood smoke, pine needles, and raw wilderness rolled off him. He stopped directly in front of Mayor Cobb's apple crate. His cold, pale blue eyes locked onto the flustered mayor. "Hold your gavel, little man," Gideon growled. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Mayor Cobb swallowed hard, gripping the gavel defensively. "See here, stranger. This is a legal town proceeding. You have no business." "I asked what the total debt was," Gideon interrupted, not raising his voice, yet commanding the absolute silence of the entire street. $400, Cobb stammered. "I'll take her," Gideon boomed, the words echoing off the wooden storefronts. He turned his imposing frame, his gaze sweeping over the astonished faces of the townsfolk before settling on the weeping widow. "I'll take her, and all 7 of her children." A stunned, breathless silence descended upon Oakhaven. The only sound was the whistling wind and the soft whimpering of the youngest Montgomery girl. Jedediah Walsh was the first to recover. He spat his matchstick onto the dirt and marched toward Gideon, his face flushed with anger. "Now see here, Mountain Man, you can't just swagger in here and upend a legal auction. The woman's contract was going to me. What the hell is a savage like you going to do with a widow and 7 brats up in the freezing peaks?" Gideon didn't flinch. He slowly turned his massive head to look down at Walsh. The sheer, terrifying stillness of the trapper made Walsh freeze in his tracks. "I reckon," Gideon said softly, a dangerous edge to his tone, "that what I do with my family is my business. And if you have a problem with it, mercantile man, you can step off this boardwalk and we can discuss it in the mud." Walsh paled, taking a quick step backward. He had seen men like Gideon before, men who lived outside the bounds of civilized law, who settled disputes with heavy steel and brutal efficiency. Gideon turned back to Mayor Cobb. He reached beneath his heavy buffalo coat and untied a thick leather pouch from his belt. He tossed it through the air. It landed on the wooden crate at Cobb's feet with a heavy, metallic thud. "There's 20 ounces of raw gold dust in there," Gideon said. "And the mules tied at the livery are carrying 50 prime, winter-thick beaver pelts. That covers the 400, plus whatever fees you bloodsuckers are tacking on to make yourselves feel like respectable men." Cobb hastily picked up the pouch, his hands trembling as he loosened the drawstring. The dull, Heavy gleam of gold caught the weak afternoon light. The mayor's eyes widened. This is more than enough. But, sir, the law requires a legal bond. Indentured contracts for minors require a guardian of upstanding. Then marry us, Gideon snapped. Sarah gasped, her head jerking up. Her tear-streaked face was a portrait of absolute shock. She stared at the giant towering above her. Marry him? A wild, scarred stranger from the mountains? Gideon finally looked directly at her. His icy blue eyes softened, just a fraction, as he took in her desperate, terrified state. He extended a massive, calloused hand, the knuckles scarred and weathered like old oak. You want to keep your children, ma'am? Gideon asked, his voice dropping to a low register meant only for her. Sarah looked at his hand, then looked back at Jedediah Walsh, who was glaring at her with a mix of fury and lust. She looked at her eldest son, Thomas, whose fists were clenched at his sides. The choice was no choice at all. It was the terrifying unknown of the wilderness, or the guaranteed destruction of her family in this miserable town. Slowly, her hands shaking violently, Sarah reached out and placed her small, pale hand in Gideon's massive grip. He pulled her to her feet with effortless strength, steadying her when her knees threatened to buckle. Send for the preacher, Gideon ordered Cobb, not breaking his gaze from the crowd. Within 20 minutes, Reverend Ezekiel Stone, a nervous, balding man clutching a worn Bible, stood on the boardwalk. The townspeople hadn't dispersed. They watched in morbid fascination as the impromptu wedding took place. There were no flowers, no music, no joyous celebration. Sarah stood numbly beside the towering mountain man, baby Charles still clutched in her left arm. When the Reverend asked for the rings, Gideon simply untied a small leather thong from his wrist that held a simple, polished piece of elk ivory and slipped it over Sarah's finger. It was far too big, but she curled her fingers into a fist to keep it from falling off. I pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Stone said hastily, looking as though he wanted to flee. May God have mercy on your souls. Pack your things, Gideon said to Sarah, his tone completely practical, utterly devoid of romance. We have 3 hours of daylight left. I want to be 20 miles out of this cesspool before we make camp. We have nothing, Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. Only what we are wearing, and a few blankets in the tent. Gideon's jaw tightened. He looked at the 7 shivering children. Wait here. He strode into Walsh's mercantile. The crowd murmured anxiously. 10 minutes later, Gideon emerged, carrying 2 massive sacks of provisions, flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, and heavy woolen blankets. He dropped them onto the boardwalk. Add it to the gold. Gideon threw over his shoulder to a seething Walsh. He led Sarah and the children to the livery stable. He purchased a sturdy, used freight wagon and 2 draft horses with the remainder of his pelts. As they loaded the meager supplies and the children into the back of the wagon, Thomas, the 14-year-old, stepped squarely into Gideon's path. The boy was shaking. Whether from the cold or from fear, Gideon couldn't tell. But Thomas tipped his chin up defiantly. If you lay a hand on my mother, the boy said, his voice cracking slightly, or if you hurt my brothers and sisters, I'll shoot you in your sleep. I swear it. Sarah gasped. Thomas! No! Gideon paused. He looked down at the boy. Most men of the era would have struck a child for such insolence. Instead, Gideon reached out and rested a heavy hand on Thomas's shoulder. You're the man of the family now, Thomas, Gideon said quietly. It's your job to protect them. But I didn't spend my winter gold just to buy a punching bag. I needed a woman to keep the cabin, and I reckon I can use the extra hands on the trap lines. You do your part, you work hard, and I won't ever give you a reason to load that rifle. Understand? Thomas stared into the trapper's eyes, searching for a lie. Finding none, he gave a curt, jerky nod and climbed into the back of the wagon. Gideon helped Sarah up to the bench seat. As she settled next to him, the sheer size of the man beside her was overwhelming. He smelled of wood smoke, leather, and dangerous independence. He flicked the reins, and the draft horses leaned into their harnesses. The wagon lurched forward, rolling out of the muddy confines of Oakhaven. Sarah looked back one last time at the town that had nearly destroyed her. Then she turned her face toward the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Absaroka Range looming in the distance. The wind whipped her bonnet, stinging her cheeks. "Mr. Cole," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling, I don't know how to thank you, but you must know, 7 children. It is a terrible burden." Gideon kept his eyes fixed on the rugged trail ahead. The sky was darkening, charcoal clouds spilling over the mountain, jagged teeth. A harsh winter was coming fast. "Out here, Mrs. Cole," Gideon replied, his voice a low rumble over the clattering wagon wheels. "There's only 2 things that matter: the work you put in and the blood you bleed for it. I didn't buy a burden. I bought a crew, and we've got a long, cold ride ahead." The journey up into the jagged teeth of the Absaroka Range was a brutal trial of ice and endurance. By the time Gideon's heavy freight wagon reached the secluded clearing near the North Fork of the Shoshone River, 2 feet of early snow already blanketed the earth. Gideon's cabin was a fortress of thick, hand-hewn lodgepole pine, built to withstand the crushing weight of mountain blizzards and the claws of roaming grizzlies. It was massive for a single trapper, but for a woman and 7 children, it was intimately close quarters. The stone hearth spanned an entire wall, radiating a fierce heat that quickly became the physical and emotional center of their new, terrifying reality. The first month was a grueling test of survival. Sarah, whose hands had only ever known the domestic chores of a town dwelling, found herself plunged into a world of raw, unyielding labor. She learned to butcher the elk Gideon dragged from the timberline, her skirts permanently stained with blood and grease. She learned to render animal fat into lye soap and thick winter candles. Mary and the twins were put to work scraping hides, while William and little Emily kept the great hearth fed with endless cords of chopped wood. Through it all, Gideon watched. He spoke little, his commands delivered in short, rumbling directives. Yet, he was not cruel. When baby Charles developed a rattling cough, it was the towering mountain man who stayed awake for 3 nights straight, boiling a pungent poultice of willow bark and pine pitch, carefully spooning it into the infant's mouth until the fever broke. It was in these quiet, desperate moments that Sarah's terror began to transmute into something entirely different: profound respect. Gideon Cole was a man forged by the wilderness, hardened by isolation, but he possessed a fierce, protective code. Thomas, the 14-year-old, underwent the most dramatic transformation. True to his word, Gideon did not treat the boy like a servant. He handed Thomas a heavy Winchester repeating rifle and taught him how to track, how to read the wind, and how to drop a mule deer at 200 yards. The boy's shoulders broadened, the lingering fear in his eyes replaced by a quiet, steely confidence, mirroring the giant who mentored him. But down in the valley, the humiliation of Jedediah Walsh festered like an untended wound. Walsh was not a man who accepted defeat, especially not when it cost him pride and cheap labor in front of the entire town of Oakhaven. Using his deep pockets and extensive influence over the local government, Walsh paid a visit to the territorial magistrate, Judge P.T. Farnsworth, a man known well for auctioning his legal seal to the highest bidder. By mid-January, as the dead of winter locked the Absaroka Mountains in an icy grip, a twisted plan was set into motion. Walsh procured a forged territorial warrant. It declared that Gideon Cole had violently kidnapped the Montgomery children, legally contracted wards of Oakhaven, and commanded their immediate retrieval. To execute this fraudulent document, Walsh didn't send a sheriff. He hired 2 ruthless men who specialized in violent resolutions. Leading the excursion was Hiram Blakesley, a disgraced former U.S. deputy marshal who had traded his badge for bounty hunting, and Amos Higgins, a notorious gun thug wanted in 3 territories for stagecoach robbery. They tracked the wagon ruts before the heavy snows covered them completely, waiting for a break in the weather to make their ascent. On a biting Tuesday morning, the sky the color of a bruised plum, the danger arrived. Gideon had left the cabin before dawn to check his far northern trap lines along Dead Man's Ridge, leaving Thomas in charge of the homestead. Sarah was at the hearth, kneading heavy sourdough on the flour-dusted table, when the frantic barking of Gideon's two wolfhounds shattered the morning silence. Thomas instantly dropped his armful of firewood. He rushed to the heavy oak door, peering through the narrow firing slit Gideon had carved into the timber. "Riders," Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave, imitating Gideon's calm under pressure. "Two of them, heavily armed." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She moved the younger children into the root cellar beneath the floorboards, a dark, earthen hold meant for potatoes and salted meat. "Stay quiet," she whispered to Mary, handing her the baby. "Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Sarah stood, pulling Gideon's heavy double-barreled shotgun from its pegs above the mantel. She broke the action, verifying the two brass cartridges, and snapped it shut with a definitive click. She walked to stand beside her eldest son. Outside, the horses stamped and snorted in the deep snow. "Open up in there!" Hiram Blakesley shouted, his voice muffled by the thick logs and howling wind. "We hold a territorial warrant from Judge Farnsworth for the retrieval of the Montgomery children. Hand them over, and the widow, and no one gets a bullet." Thomas looked at his mother. The boy was trembling, but his grip on the Winchester was white-knuckled and steady. "We don't know you," Sarah yelled back, her voice projecting through the heavy timber door. "My husband is not here. You are trespassing on a legal homestead." Amos Higgins let out a cruel, barking laugh. "Husband? That savage didn't marry you, lady. He bought you. Now open this door before we burn you out and take the brats from the ashes." High up on the crest of Dead Man's Ridge, the wind carried the echo of the shouting. Gideon Cole paused, his snowshoes sinking into the powder. He possessed the uncanny, almost supernatural intuition of a predator. He abandoned his furs, unslung his massive .50 caliber Sharps buffalo rifle from his shoulder, and began a reckless, breakneck descent down the steep, timbered slope. Back at the cabin, Blakesley lost his patience. He spurred his horse forward, raising his boot to kick the heavy door latch. Crack! A bullet from Thomas's Winchester splintered the wood just inches from Blakesley's head. The boy had fired through the slit. "Little bastard!" Blakesley roared, yanking his revolver from its holster and unleashing a blind volley of lead into the cabin door. Inside, Sarah tackled Thomas to the floor as wood chips and hot lead showered the room. Higgins dismounted, pulling a heavy iron crowbar from his saddlebags, intending to pry the heavy window shutters off their iron hinges. He took 2 steps through the knee-deep snow. He never took a third. The report of Gideon's Sharps rifle sounded like a cannon firing across the valley. A massive plume of white smoke erupted from the tree line 60 yards away. Higgins was thrown backward as if kicked by a mule, the heavy buffalo slug tearing through his shoulder and spinning him into the snowbank, screaming in agony. Blakesley's horse reared, panicked by the deafening blast. The bounty hunter struggled to control the animal, wildly scanning the dense, shadowy pines. Gideon didn't bother to reload the single-shot rifle. He burst from the tree line like a terrifying force of nature, moving with shocking speed for a man of his immense size. He drew a heavy, razor-sharp hunting knife from his belt, his eyes completely devoid of mercy. Blakesley spotted the charging giant and fired twice. One bullet grazed Gideon's heavy buffalo coat, the other bit into the trunk of a pine. Before Blakesley could cock the hammer for a third shot, Gideon was upon him. The mountain man grabbed Blakesley by the heavy leather collar of his duster and physically ripped the man from his saddle. Blakesley hit the frozen earth with a sickening thud, the breath knocked from his lungs. Before he could raise his weapon, Gideon's heavy boot came down squarely on the bounty hunter's wrist, shattering the bone. Blakesley screamed, dropping his revolver. Gideon knelt, pressing the cold steel of his hunting knife against Blakesley's throat. The mountain man's breathing was heavy, misting in the freezing air, his scarred face inches from the terrified bounty hunter. "Judge Farnsworth," Gideon whispered, his voice a lethal, rumbling promise, "has no jurisdiction on my mountain. You tell Jedediah Walsh that if he ever looks toward this ridge again, I will come down to Oakhaven and burn his mercantile to the ground with him inside it. Nod if you understand me." Blakesley, weeping from the pain in his shattered wrist, nodded frantically. Gideon stood, kicking Blakesley's revolver into the deep snow. He hauled the bleeding Amos Higgins up by his belt and threw him roughly over the back of his horse, then forced Blakesley to mount up. He slapped the rump of the lead horse, sending the terrified men fleeing back down the treacherous mountain trail. Gideon turned toward the cabin. The heavy door slowly creaked open. Sarah stood in the doorway, the shotgun still gripped in her hands, her chest heaving. Thomas stood just behind her, his rifle lowered. Gideon walked up the steps. He looked at the splintered wood, then looked down at his wife. The fierce, terrifying adrenaline of the fight slowly drained from his eyes, replaced by a profound, shaking relief. He reached out and gently took the heavy shotgun from Sarah's trembling hands, setting it against the log wall. Without a word, he pulled her into his massive arms. Sarah collapsed against his chest, burying her face in the coarse fur of his coat, breathing in the scent of pine, gunpowder, and the man who had just risked his life for a family that wasn't bound to him by blood, but by an unbreakable choice. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him just as fiercely. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, letting out a long, shaky breath. Gideon reached out with one massive hand and pulled the boy into the embrace as well. The younger children, hearing the silence, slowly crept up from the cellar, clustering around the tall trapper and their mother. "They won't be back," Gideon said softly into Sarah's hair. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her jaw was set with a new, permanent strength. "I know," Sarah whispered. "Because they know who this family belongs to." Gideon smiled, a rare, genuine softening of his weathered face. He kissed her forehead, a quiet seal on a vow that needed no preacher and no town council to make it real. They were forged in the ice, defended in the snow, and bound together by the wild, untamed heart of the West. Today, deep in the archives of Park County, Wyoming, faded property deeds tell the true tale of Gideon and Sarah Cole. They didn't just survive the merciless Absaroka frontier. They conquered it. Raising 7 adopted children and 3 of their own, their sprawling cattle ranch became a legendary sanctuary. It stands as a historic testament to a desperate widow's courage and a wild mountain man's stunning, redeeming choice.